Just maybe for the benefit of those who weren't here last night, I know this is on your program as well, but maybe just to see it all in one slide together. This is sort of where we're going this weekend, God willing. Last night we sort of had an introduction through the words of Proverbs 31, which we learned were actually the words of a mother that she had taught her son, and that she was showing this son that the true value and character of a virtuous woman is also reflected in the same, a virtuous man. And we looked at that chapter, realizing, brothers and sisters and young people, that really behind that chapter of an extraordinary list of actions that lady performs is actually an attitude. And that's the core relevant application of that chapter to all of us, brothers and sisters included. That God actually is calling men and women to have characters of integrity and driven by the fear of the Lord. And so we saw that the strength of all these women that we're going to look at actually comes back to, and we'll see this in our final study tomorrow, God willing, that all of these strengths of virtue and character that we see in the women, especially Jehoshabeath this afternoon, actually comes from this driving, convicted fear of Yahweh in their life. And that means that these sisters that we're going to consider are people that we can actually relate to. I mean, we're going to consider Jehoshabeath this afternoon. It's very unlikely that any of us will be in a position like she was in, or Deborah in jail, or other sisters that we may come consider, like the Hebrew midwives. So sometimes you can look at these, just like brethren will look at characters like Joshua and feel, well, how do you relate in some ways to being at the front of an army with a sword and leading the victories of Yahweh? But really, all of these lessons are just to drive home, what's driving this character? What's behind this attitude, this woman's faith? And it's her fear of Yahweh. So we're going to keep coming back to that and try and take lessons from them. I'll just kind of like a little disclaimer first for this study. It's going to be a little bit different because almost half of this study is painting the background to this sister Jehoshabeath. And so if you get to the point where you think, well, when are we actually going to get to Jehoshabeath? Well, maybe halfway through, okay? You're going to have to hold on because the actual record says, well, there's about 2 verses about Jehoshabeath. So you might wonder how can we stretch those 2 verses into a full study? We're not going to look at every Hebrew word and kind of tease out. But the power in this sister, brothers and sisters, although she says nothing in the record, not a word, comes from the background that we're going to look at in the context in which she lives out her faith. So that's what we want to do. I'm just going to read you a quote from an author by the name of Morgan, commenting on this period in Israel and Judah's history. There are hours in human history when it seems as though evil were almost all-powerful. It entrenches itself in great strength. It builds up great ramparts. It inaugurates policies of the utmost craft and cleverness. It seems to be able to bind together a kingdom which is invincible. All this is false seeming. There is no finality, no security, in the apparent might of iniquity. You know, brothers and sisters, young people, we come to a section where this sister lives in Israel and Judah's history, which is possibly the darkest. And it seems that we are Israel to the north is falling apart piece by piece as Ahab's house and his descendants are gradually destroyed. And Jehu accomplishes that. He goes about and takes all of Ahab's descendants off the scene. And so what you find in the northern kingdom is this mishmash of dynasties that come and go and kings kill each other, and everything is lost in terms of what God originally intended for his people and their worship. And now when we look at the kingdom of Judah in 2 Chronicles 21 and 22, we actually see a time in Israel and Judah's history, this kingdom's history, specifically in Judah, where when you read the record and you don't know what's coming next, you almost could think that this is going to be the extinguishing of the promises of God to the house of David. I mean, everyone knows, and Sunday school students here know the promises to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that he would have a throne that would continue. But in 2 Chronicles 21 and 22, we come down to the very, very last thread of that chain of kings from the house of David. So much so that you almost think when you read this chapter that, well, this is it, this is the end. And I actually think we've got to put ourselves in the minds of the last few faithful men and women of this time and realize that they were watching this. And they saw that the house of David was getting thinner and thinner, and the people were being killed and assassinated, and we are down to the very last few people. And there would have been people at this time, brothers and sisters, whose faith would have been put totally in a challenging situation, realizing or wondering whether God really is with this nation and whether God is really going to keep the line of David flowing and whether God is actually going to keep his promise. That's the state of darkness at this time. And I truly believe that the faith of faithful people would have been greatly challenged. How do you hold on to the promises of God in a time when it looks like they're falling apart? And literally, brothers and sisters, literally, you're seeing people being assassinated that are from the house of David. And together with that, you're trying to reconcile, but God's made promises through this house. So what's he going to do? Is he going to let them all fall apart? What we see is an extraordinary story of redemption of that line. And it comes down to a faithful and extraordinary sister. Well, let's just paint the picture of the background, brothers and sisters, as we trace it from the beginning of chapter 21. Just remind yourself what this time was like in the history of Israel and Judah. We come to the son of Jehoshaphat in chapter 21. And we've just had an amazing record of Jehoshaphat in the earlier chapters and how this man had so much to learn and how faithful he was in lots of ways. But look what it says in chapter 21, verse 1. Jehoshaphat rested with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Then Jehoram, his son, reigned in his place. So there's high hopes, really, if you're living at this time, after a man like Jehoshaphat has come and learned so much in his life from mistakes and successes. And you think, well, Jehoram surely will carry that on and learn. But look what it says. This Jehoram had brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat. Verse 2, Azariah, and it lists them by name. Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Azariahu, Michael, and Shephatiah. All these were the sons of Jehoshaphat, king of Israel. Now, we're told that twice in the verse. And the record is trying to get us to have a feel for this family. That's what I believe is happening. That the writer of this record is trying to help us understand that Jehoshaphat had a good number of sons. And this was high hopes for the kingdom. But look what happens. All these were the brothers of Jehoram. And look what Jehoshaphat had done. It says in verse 3, the father gave them great gifts of silver and gold and precious things, with also, not just gifts of money, but also fortified cities in Judah. I mean, the kingdom that these brothers, and especially Jehoram, were inheriting was gift-wrapped, okay? They inherited all this goodness from their father. Fortified cities, money, security, all those things, right? But it says of Jehoram, at the end of verse 3, he gave the kingdom to Jehoram because he was the firstborn. Now, if you're a firstborn out there, young people, brothers and sisters, you might think, well, yeah, that makes sense. The firstborn gets the kingdom, and the other brothers get a present as well. Okay, they get little prezzies on the side, some money, some fortified cities that they might look after. But the firstborn, which is congruent with how things normally worked, definitely gets the kingdom. And you would think if you're Jehoram, well, that's great. I've been set up for my father. I've inherited all of this. I really haven't worked for it. My brothers are happy. They've had a cut as well, and I get the most. Perfect. Perfect setting for an establishment of a spiritual leadership in the nation. But verse 4, we know, is an extraordinary verse. Now, when Jehoram was established over his kingdom of his father, he strengthened himself and killed all his brothers with the sword. And not only that, and also others of the princes of Israel. So it wasn't good enough for Jehoram. This is an extraordinary thing. And this is the extent to which power will make you go. Jehoram is perfectly set up. His kingdom was established. And now, as soon as he is there, driven by a jealousy and an insecurity, he kills all of his brothers and doesn't even stop there. He kills all of the other successful princes in Israel at that time. Now, imagine yourself, brothers and sisters and young people, as a citizen at that time. And the political news is not just that there's some, propaganda and there's political debates happening in Parliament. No, the king, who was already king, just went and killed all the other brothers. And these seem like good men. What would you feel like if you were at a nation at this time? What if you were doing the family Bible readings, a couple weeks after that happened, you're reading the promises to David? How would you read 2 Samuel 7 and recount the promises to David, knowing that that's what's happening in the nation with the house of David? Well, look what Jehoram is like. Verse 5, Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel to the north, just as the house of Ahab had done, because he had the daughter of Ahab for wife. Now, brothers and sisters, I've given you a copy of the family tree that's relevant for our study this afternoon, and I have it on the overhead as well. But this Jehoram had married Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab, and it doesn't tell us here, but it's the daughter of Jezebel, of course, as well. So at this point in Israel, in Judah particularly, there's not only a desperate situation with political massacre and slaying all these people, but now Jehoram is turning to Israel that was falling apart anyway, which is a bit strange. But now Jehoram's turning to Israel and making a marriage alliance with the daughter of Jezebel. And he's bringing that down into the nation of Judah. Now you really got to think, and what I want you to do during this study is put yourself in the position of someone who's watching this unfold. Now the king is marrying the daughter of Jezebel and Ahab. Pretty extraordinary. Well, God intervenes, and the prophet Elijah in this chapter writes a letter, and the Arabians come down. And we know the story that God stirs up against Jehoram the spirit in verse 16, the Philistines and the Arabians who were near the Ethiopians. And they came down in verse 17 to Judah and invaded it and carried away all the possessions that were found in the king's house, and also his sons and his wives, so that there was not a son left to him except for Jehoahaz, which is also Ahaziah, the youngest of his sons. Now things just got worse because there's no longer a family left, brothers and sisters. There's one individual who's truly of the line of David. One left. One individual. The promises of God seem to be hanging on just this one person. And you would think, all right, this is how bad it's going to get. We've got one little string left in the promise of God to the promises of David, and it's this man. And surely people would have thought, okay, learn the lessons. Ethiopians have come down and pillaged the kingdom, and this guy must have learned the lesson. His dad's been taken. Well, he will be shortly, and all of my other brothers are gone. Surely I can reform. And that's what you'd think people would expect. And look what it does. And if we didn't think that, well, look at verse 18. After all this, Yahweh struck him. This is the death of Jehoram. Struck him in his intestines with an incurable disease. God doesn't do that very often, brothers and sisters. In the record of Scripture, it's not that often, and Herod's another case in the New Testament, it's not very often that God strikes people with nasty diseases and lets verse 19 happen. It happened in the course of time, after the end of 2 years, that his intestines came out because of his sickness, and he died in severe pain. You think of, we're given grotesque details because this man himself was grotesque. This man, think about it, the king in your nation has done all this evil. Now he's lost all his sons except for one, and God smites him with this intestinal disorder. And I was sort of intrigued by what this was, and I started trying to look up in various commentaries and dictionaries, but what is this? And I stopped, because it's gross. Like, you don't even want to look into the details. It's this grotesque whatever disorder, and it comes out of him, and he dies in severe pain. That's what God thought of this time. And that's how the state of the nation was. Look what it says about the people's thoughts towards him. And his people made a burning for him, like the burning for his fathers. He was 32 years old when he became king. He reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, verse 20. And the New King James says, to no one's sorrow, he departed. However, they buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. The King James says, without being desired, to no one's sorrow he departed. That gives you a little insight into how people were feeling at this time. With the development of all this evil, as things get lower and lower and lower, this man suffers for 2 years in his intestines, and when he's gone, no one cares, and no one's sad. So, happy times. Ahaziah, his son. Maybe this is a refresh. This is now in the chapter that we're looking at. Verse 22, the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah his son, youngest son, king in his place. For the raiders who came with the Arabians into the camp had killed the older sons. So Ahaziah, his son of Jehoram, is king of Judah, reigned. And he is the last one in the promises in the line of David. And he's 42 years old when he becomes king, and he reigns 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, and she's described in this verse as the granddaughter of Omri. Brothers and sisters, what do we know about, what's the characterization of Omri? How is he described in the record? Anyone know the little epithet that's given to him? What do we know about Omri? She's his granddaughter. Oh, you can call it out if you want. What do we know about Omri? What's the little epithet that's given to him? Yeah, absolutely. He was the worst yet. And we're pointed out that this Athaliah is the granddaughter of Omri. So you've got a king on the throne now whose father was so wicked he killed all his brothers, and he died of an intestinal disease, and they came out and he died in severe pain. And your mother is Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, who was the worst yet. And your king. Look what it says. Verse 3. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother advised him to do wickedly. Brothers and sisters, if you ever want a classic contrast to Proverbs 31, it's 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 3. Same situation. You think about the contrast to last night. Here is the advice of a mother in Proverbs 31 that she caused her son to memorize and recite. And it's all keeping from strong drink and being intoxicated to the point of forgetting the law. It's keeping your strength from immoral women and giving yourself over to that. It's looking out for the poor and needy. That was the advice of the woman, the mother, in Proverbs 31 to this young man, King Lemuel. Now, brothers and sisters, you think about the contrast between a good mother's advice and a foolish mother's advice, and the difference that can make in an individual. His mother advised him to do wickedly. And brothers and sisters, that gives us a good little insight into the fact that mothers absolutely are influential in the king's record. And we know that, but also elsewhere through the scriptural record. That mothers clearly were good counselors. They had the ear of their son as a prince in training, or when he became king. And they did have that interaction. They were able to pass on advice. And some used it and made a difference in their children's lives. Some for good and some for evil. Look at verse 4. Therefore he did evil. Therefore, because of his mother's advice, therefore he did evil in the sight of Yahweh like the house of Ahab, for that whole house were his counselors after the death of his father to his destruction. And he followed their advice And he makes an alliance with the house of Ahab. And we're told that Jehu finds out about this in verse 8. And it happened when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab in Israel, and found the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who served Ahaziah, that he killed them. So he kills his relatives in verse 8. And he searched for Ahaziah himself, and they caught him. He was hiding in Samaria, and brought him to Jehu. And when they had killed him, we don't even know how they did it. It's just done. When they'd killed him, they buried him, because they said he is the son of Jehoshabeath, who sought Yahweh with all his heart. So, brothers and sisters, here's the key verse. So the house of Ahaziah had no one to assume power over the kingdom. Now, this is it. This is where brothers and sisters, in times of distress, looking for signs of God at work, begin to have their faith shaken. No one now, it got down to one, but now there's no one to assume the throne of David. Not one left. Now, it's easy for us because we know bits and pieces of the story and as it progresses. But if you were in Israel right now, in Judah, you would not know that. And your faith could easily be shaken. There's no one left, brothers and sisters. And not only that, here's further background to the times. It gets worse. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead. Athaliah is the granddaughter of Omri. Her son is dead. That she arose and went to the house of mourning for many days. Doesn't say that, brothers and sisters. There's not even a slight hint of a sniff of sorrow. Look at how that reads. Ahaziah saw that her son was dead, and she arose and destroyed all the royal heirs of the house of Judah. Now you think about that. Who does that include? If you're Athaliah, your son was king, and he's dead. Your husband's dead too, Jehoram, and you're left, if you just refer to your little family tree. Now, she goes, the instant she hears news of his death, she grabs the sword, she grabs her military advisors and the people that she has control over, and she goes out and hunts every person down who possibly could jump on that throne. People, maybe other families who maybe have leadership qualities like other dynasties that happened in Israel, because she's used to that, right? What happens in Israel over time to the north is people that thought they should be on the throne took over and jumped on, and someone else killed them and a new person jumped up. So she looks around, and in a calculated way, and I believe she probably had a good list happening for the last couple of years, she grabs that list and goes through and kills every single one of them. Now, brothers and sisters and young people and grandmas, that meant in that hunt for other people that she would have killed relatives, maybe even grandchildren that would have been remotely related to that situation. Can you think about what it takes to be a grandma, because she was a grandma at this point. You think about what it takes to be a grandma and going around and killing not just older men, but all of the younger ones who potentially could take that throne, had any relationship. You think of the mindset and the twisted perversion that's there in this lady's mind. And I believe, brothers and sisters, that she was the type of person that had the big table out and had all her advisors and had a big family tree. And she'd been drawing that family tree and making sure she knows who's who and who's where. She had that family tree laid out on the table, and they crossed branch by branch by branch off that tree, looking for anyone who possibly could get that kingdom. She was literally, brothers and sisters, taking the line of David and chopping that tree down branch by branch, right in the face of God's eternal promise. She spits on it and has no remorse, no heart whatsoever. You know, I actually believe, it's not hard to believe, but that's sort of what comes out of the record. She was just waiting for her son to get killed. And when she heard that that Jehu had come down and destroyed him, she's like, yes, it's my turn, and off she goes. desperate for recognition, desperate for power. Now, brothers and sisters, enter the sister that we want to spend some time with. I reckon it's one of the most extraordinary verses in Scripture, verse 11, because of everything that it doesn't say. But Jehoshabeath, the daughter of the king, who was Jehoram, who was dead, and he'd watched him die for 2 years, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons. Now listen. From among the king's sons who were being murdered. It was still happening. And Athaliah was still going. This wasn't something that just happened in an afternoon. She had all her men go out and done. This is something that took time and cold, calculated planning of where will that person be at this time and where have they gone and traveled to? We're going to hunt them down. And while they were being murdered, Jehoshabeath takes Joash, almost a newborn, and steals him away and puts him in his nurse in a bedroom. So Jehoshabeath, the daughter of King Jehoram, the wife of Jehoiada the priest, for she was the sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah so that she did not kill him. Now, brothers and sisters, here's our family tree that you've got in front of you. And tonight, the power of this sister comes from her family tree, the power of the lessons that we get from her. You look at that, and if you can't see it, it should be on that handout. And maybe if you don't have a handout, does everyone have one? Okay, all right, good, all right. Let's just stop for a second and make sure we got this family tree as good as we can understand from the scriptural record. Okay, I'm just going to go away from here. Is that okay? All right. Have a look at the family tree and just soak in what we're being told, right? We're talking about Jehoshabeath. She is brother to Ahaziah, who has just been killed. And her father is Jehoram, who died with that intestinal disease and disorder and severe pain. And it seems, brothers and sisters, and there's some discussion about this and possibly another way to see it, but I believe it is highly likely that her mother was Athaliah. Now, the discussion comes from the fact that verse 11 never says that her mother was Athaliah. It says that her father was Jehoram, and some people, because of the age gap between her and Jehoiada the priest and a few other things, probably think that it's likely that Athaliah maybe wasn't her direct mother, but Jehoram had some other woman, and Jehoshabeath was the daughter of that union. But we're not told that, brothers and sisters, and I actually think a lot of the commentary that's said on this verse avoids trying to see Jehoshabeath as the daughter of Athaliah because it just could never be to have such a distinct and different daughter that, from a mother like that. But I actually think it's very possible. Let's just put it this way. Even if Jehoshabeath is not the direct daughter of Athaliah, she grew up in that household, right? She grew up in that household. And that household meant that her grandma was Jezebel. And her grandfather was Ahab. And her great-grandfather was Omri. Okay, I get confused with family trees, but hopefully this keeps it clear. You think about that. This is your family tree that you're coming from, at least as close as we can get it. You have a father, Jehoram, a mother, Athaliah, grandmother, Jezebel, great-grandfather, Omri. Now that is an extraordinary place to come from, an extraordinary tree to follow on from. Brothers and sisters, that's made a little bit more important when we look at the summaries of these people. You think about the people on this family tree. This is where you're coming from. This is where you grew up in and the people you had to do with. Your great-grandfather Omri was described in the record as the worst yet. Your grandfather Ahab was a murderer of innocent people. Your grandmother Jezebel was a murderer of innocent people and a leader of false worship and Baal worship. Your mother was a grotesque murderer with no heart. And your father had murdered all his brothers. And your husband was going to be a priest who during all that time as well had stayed apart and been faithful to Yahweh. And I believe, brothers and sisters, this is a pretty extraordinary marriage between these two people. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on Jehoiada, but he is an amazing counterpart to this amazing woman. And it'd take a whole other study just to go into him and how they work together in this amazing Proverbs 31 fashion. But these are two people that had stayed away from the grotesque things that were happening at this time. And they found each other and were married, and they made a great change in the nation. But that's your family tree. And your brother himself had done wickedly, and he was murdered. Now, brothers and sisters, it begs the question in young people, and we've seen so many times in Scripture that even though you have a terrible family background, and maybe your family isn't in the truth, or some of them have left, or some of them, like for Jehoshabeath, it was pretty extraordinary. Not many, I don't think anyone, well, no one would have a family tree like this, all right? We know that. But that's extraordinary. But you know, this woman, one of the great lessons that comes out from her is that she acts and is governed by a faith completely despite her family tree. Of all people in Scripture, I believe, she could have been a young lady who could have totally given up because of her family circumstances. And that could have been a massive excuse and almost justifiable. How could you ever go out on a limb in the context of this family tree with an influence like Jezebel as your grandmother, and an influence like Ahab as your granddad, and Omri as your great-granddad, and Athaliah as your mother? And this is extraordinary. But saying nothing in the record, she comes to the fore and takes part in an enormous act of faith. Brothers and sisters, let's just spend one little bit of time thinking about the extraordinary act of faith this was. Verse 11, Jehoshabeath, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah. Now, if you remember, just a couple verses earlier, we'd just been told that Ahaziah had no one to succeed the power of the throne. Do you know why it says that? There was someone, but it says that because the only one who could was like still almost a newborn baby. And everyone else from that point forward was being killed. And this young boy is stolen away, hardly 1 year old. And she takes him while everyone else is being murdered. Now, can you imagine what that would have been like for Jehoshabeath to do this type of thing? Brothers and sisters, get in your mind who you're dealing with as Jehoshabeath. Your mother is on a manhunt. And brothers and sisters, it is true that if you are Jehoshabeath, this young sister of faith, and if you know that if you are ever caught stealing Joash, and your mother finds you, she will have no problem killing you on the spot. And surely Jehoshabeath knew that, brothers and sisters and young people. Absolutely. You are dealing with a woman who has no concern or care or heart or emotional feeling for family members. Not at all. And your mother would have killed you on the spot. Now, brothers and sisters, that wasn't just a one-off event. Think about this. Do you think that Athaliah knew about Joash? I mean, don't you think it's extraordinary that, well, what about Joash? Like, did Athaliah not know about him? Now, I just appeal to the grandmas. Okay, you can talk to grandmas. Think about this. Every grandma that I've ever come across, okay, and I know my grandma was amazing at this, there's not a grandma out there that would have a grandchild and not know about it. They wouldn't be like either there at the hospital or the first one to know all the details about how much it weighed and what its middle name was and all those kind of things. Grandmas are all over that. They love their grandchildren. Like that doesn't pass you by. And I am absolutely certain that Athaliah's little family tree had a little branch, Joash, because he'd been born. And she knew that, and she saw the pregnancy happen, and she knew that is, even that the mother was pregnant, she knew that that's actually a potential heir to the throne. And when that little kid's born, I'm going to take his life. She had that all planned. There's no doubt, brothers and sisters, that she was all over this. So that means that as Jehoshabeath stole that little boy away, you know absolutely for certain that your mother knows that there's one who wasn't crossed off the list, and it's Joash, and he's still out there. And I just wonder what was going through the mind of Athaliah and also Jehoshabeath. You know that this isn't just a nice, easy stealing away. He was being sought for. And you know that, brothers and sisters, she hid this little boy while Athaliah reigned for 6 years. Now, I reckon that is an extraordinary thing to think about today. Inspiration for faith comes from those who have gone before, who have been in circumstances that we can think about and weigh up and be impressed by where their conviction led them and what they did. And brothers and sisters, you think if you were Jehoshabeath for 6 years with a mother like Athaliah, how frightening that would be, and how much conviction and absolute faith in God that would take. Do you know, you think about the logistics of this. If there was any hint to Athaliah that Joash was still around the place, she'd be all over it. And you just imagine that if you as Jehoshabeath came in one afternoon to the queen's quarters and you had a little bit of baby sick on your shoulder, that she would have seen that a mile away. Because all the time in Athaliah's mind, she knew that something was a bit funny, that little branch on the family tree that she never really got to cross off never really showed up. And don't you think that maybe Athaliah would have been suspicious of faithful people like Jehoshabeath at that time? There's no doubt she would have known that Jehoshabeath was not in the same mindset and mind frame as her, in the same household. Don't you think that Jehoshabeath, brothers and sisters, would have had a hard time for 6 years with that unnamed nurse hiding him? And it says that she was hidden in the house of God for he was hidden with the nurse in the house of God for 6 years. Don't you think, really, the house of God is the best place because Athaliah had nothing to do with the house of God, partly, and we'll see actually she did. But Athaliah, maybe the last place she would go looking is the house of God. It was in ruin at this time anyway. So, but don't you think that maybe Athaliah was a bit more clever to look out and keep an eye out for possible... What if Athaliah was near the house of God, or one of her spies or henchmen was, and they heard crying from this little... when he comes out, this is a young boy. He had been, since a little baby, for 6 years, grown up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In his 7th year. Don't you think that someone might have heard this little boy crying in some remote room hidden away in the house of God? What did they do with all the nappies and getting food in there for 6 years? How did they do that? How do you maintain a faith for fear of your life for 6 years that at any point you could have been discovered and found out and killed on the spot, you and your nurse? How do you handle that? How do you have such conviction, brothers and sisters? How does this sister trust in God so fervently? Do you know, we might think, and I did when I first started looking at this record, that the house of God was a very safe place, especially from Athaliah, but it's not, brothers and sisters. I want you to have a look at detail in chapter 24. And this is a relevant detail to bring out the real power of this woman and her faith. Chapter 24, we know that later on, Joash, when he's 7 years old, he becomes king. So his whole life growing up was in that temple. He's 7 years old, verse 1 of chapter 24, and he reigns 40 years in Jerusalem. Now, what we do know is that in verse 4, it happened after this that Joash set his heart on repairing the house of Yahweh. Now, okay, so after 7 years, you're released from the house. You were brought up in the house of the Lord. That's how you were saved from other people. That's how you were hidden with a nurse and Jehoshabeath. And this is where you grew up. So the first thing that his heart is connected to is the house of Yahweh, because he'd lived there for 7 years. That's where he grew up. That was his nursery in hiding. And he wants to repair it. Do you know why he had to repair it, brothers and sisters? Because someone had broken into the house of Yahweh and ripped it apart. And that someone is described in verse 7. For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the house of God and had also presented all the dedicated things of the house of Yahweh to the Baals. So you see this, brothers and sisters, just when you think that, wow, the house of Yahweh was a really safe place for Jehoshabeath to hide for all that long time, this little boy, it was not. People were not opposed to breaking in. And those sons of Athaliah, driven probably by her greed and corruption, were not above breaking in to the house of Yahweh. So maybe, just maybe, brothers and sisters, for that 6 long years, you also would have been in fear of Athaliah breaking into that house once again and stealing the things that maybe they didn't get the first time and suddenly coming across this little boy. You think about all, he learned to walk in the house of Yahweh with that nurse and Jehoshabeath. He learned to speak. He learned everything from Jehoshabeath and that nurse over 7 years of his childhood. You think of all the enormous development that happens between the ages of 0 and 7. All of that happened in secret, in hiding with this woman. That's a pretty amazing thing. And brothers and sisters, let's just stop and ask a little question. Where did Jehoshabeath get her inspiration from? That's a good question, because this is an extraordinary time, an extraordinary situation. How is it that you get a woman with this family tree showing up at this time when all hope of God's promises seem to be on a knife edge and maybe even lost, and you're there stealing away the last possible thread to the promises of God, and you hide it for 6 years? Where did she get her inspiration from? Well, brothers and sisters, there's a beautiful example that had gone before her. I really want you to notice this, and worth marking in for remembering in the future how powerful examples of faith inspire others. I believe, brothers and sisters, she got an enormous conviction and help in her faith from the prophet Obadiah. Can you come to where we're told about the prophet Obadiah? This is 1 Kings chapter 18. Now listen, I'll just tell you a little kind of journey of Bible study for me. I have never, for me, looking at the life of Jehoshabeath and the extraordinary circumstances, never noticed 1 Kings chapter 18. The last time it came up in the readings, we were reading 1 Kings 18, and I almost fell off my seat because suddenly it clicked. This is a source of inspiration for Jehoshabeath. And I've always had that question rolling around. And there's other sources of inspiration for her, no doubt. But look at this. 1 Kings 18. Came to pass, verse 1, after many days that the word of Yahweh came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, go present yourself to Ahab. So this is when Ahab is doing his thing. House of Ahab's happening. And I will send rain on the earth. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab, and there was a severe famine in Samaria. And Ahab had called Obadiah, who was in charge of his house. Now Obadiah feared Yahweh greatly. And in fact, he says later in verse 12 that he had feared Yahweh from his youth. No, that's just a lesson as well. There's some of these things for young people, you might think, well, okay, this is at a time when you're a little bit older and you have that fear of Yahweh. But just keep in mind that people like Obadiah were people that genuinely developed a fear of Yahweh when they were young and a dependence on him. And look what actions this led to. Verse 4. For so it was, now notice the language here, right? Carefully. While Jezebel massacred the prophets of Yahweh, that Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them, 50 to a cave, and had fed them with bread and water. Now, brothers and sisters, this had happened just years before Jehoshabeath, when Ahab was still alive in the northern kingdom doing his thing, and while Jezebel, who is Jehoshabeath's grandmother, was massacring the prophets of Yahweh. And during that time, there was an extraordinary prophet called Obadiah, who, while under fear of his own life, had taken those prophets, hid them in a cave, and fed them with bread and water while they were being massacred by Jezebel. And sometime later, Jehoshabeath, when her mother is massacring the line of David, finds herself in a very similar position, and takes inspiration from this prophet. And she says, if God was with him, he will be with me too. And takes one little boy and hides him away in the closest cave she can find in the house of Yahweh. But I believe, brothers and sisters, as well, not only having people gone before her that were inspirational to her and acting out of amazing faith in circumstances like that, there's something else that this woman is driven by. I want you to note